Testing, testing. Good evening, guys. Welcome to your first review session for APUS history. Like I just mentioned in the posting, if you could just give me a heads up. If you're able to hear me, let me know, just one or two of you. And if you're having any sort of issues, please let me know as well. So I'll hold off for a second and wait for somebody to send me a message through today's meet about whether or not you can hear and see me, or if you're not. Thank you for the message that you can hear and see. So if you are having problems with what's going on with the feed, please let me know so I can help you out with that. And hopefully, if you do have any sort of issues, we'll be able to help you out with that. So let's get started with our stream for tonight. You can feel free to kick in any sort of questions you want to onto today's meet page. That's what I'll be checking. So don't email or use Schoology for the time being, and I'll be able to answer any questions there. So I'll just start at the bottom of the page from the questions we had earlier. The first one was, what were some of the main roles of the British? And I'm not certain if I'm understanding where the question is coming from. And so I'll give it my best shot to see if I can kind of nail that for Kate. When we think about the British are known for when they start up their colonies that they have diverse motivations rather than the Spanish, who are either for gold, God, and glory. We have all sorts of different religions, all sorts of different farmers, all sorts of different money-making schemes. And so all of that is going to play into the different roles that you see the British taking on here in the New World. So hopefully that is where you're going. If I'm not understanding where the question is headed, please absolutely feel free to add in a comment here so I can help out with that. Jacob's got a question asking, what was the significance of John Winthrop? John Winthrop, and I saw a couple other comments in the questions, like, I know I'm supposed to worry about sitting on a hill, but what specifically does that mean? So John Winthrop is going to be the main person driving the movement of the Great Puritan Migration in 1630. When John Winthrop starts this movement, he is leading a mass exodus from England over to America to find a place where they can have a religiously pure experiment taking place. They want to try out a Puritan lifestyle. So initially they're supposed to settle closer to Jamestown, and they're able to veer up instead to the Massachusetts area to have a more isolated place where they can be just setting up their own colony. For John Winthrop, then, he sets up this image that they're going to be doing everything in God's purposes, and they're going to be watching out for one another. So when they talk about being a city on a hill, they make all these promises that they're going to create a religiously pure place. And they also put a bunch of pressure on themselves that if they fail, they're going to make God mad. They're going to embarrass God in front of the rest of the world. And so there's a ton of pressure on these colonists to do a good job. And that's being manufactured largely by John Winthrop's influence. The next question says, what's the importance of John Smith and John Rolfe? And so remember, those are the two Johns from Virginia. John Smith is famous as a military adventurer who is with the Virginia Company. And when they set up the colony in Virginia, he is the person who is able to bring military discipline to the colony with his famous saying, "Those who don't work shall not eat." And so he really whips them into shape and gets them through starving time. John Rolfe is the guy who smuggles in tobacco and teaches people to cultivate that in Virginia. And that's their big money-making crop that's going to take off with their gigantic plantation systems that we learned about today with their headright system and eventually African slavery. So both Johns are important. They're just different people, unlike what you see in the Pocahontas movie. It says here, next question, even though the South had large plantations, were there a lot of small farmers? There were. And so when you think about the Deep South, what we focused a lot on was those large plantation owners that were very much taking advantage of either the headright system in Virginia or the Barbados-style plantation system in the Carolinas. You will have a bunch of small farmers, but typically the best land in the Deep South is going to be bought up by the rich plantation owners, especially along rivers. And a lot of the small farmers will find themselves pushed further and further in the backcountry into Native American territory or further away from rivers. And a lot of those individuals are going to become very hostile towards the natives, but also hostile towards the rich elite people on the coast, who they see as taking advantage of these poor farmers who are stuck in the backcountry. So there's a lot of hostility that's going to result from that. Your next question, what was the Jeremiad and why was it important in the New England colonies? And a Jeremiad is not something that's unique to New England. A Jeremiad is a fire and brimstone sort of sermon that happens in church, and it's meant to intimidate or scare people into becoming better Christians. And so it's very much about fire and brimstone and going to hell. And the hope is that people will be scared straight. And more of those start happening in the mid-1600s as they feel the Puritan influence slipping, like we talked about the Dominion of New England and the Halfway Covenant and the Salem witch trials. There are many people in the New England colonies who aren't feeling the same sort of religious fervor that they had in the early 1600s. And so that's where a lot of those sermons are coming from at that time. The next question says, was Pennsylvania only a Quaker haven, or was it filled with other groups like the Pilgrims? And so when you think about Pennsylvania or any of the colonies, they will give you a story in your textbook about what the majority group looks like. But there is always people who are kind of slipping in who don't quite fit with the dominant theme. And so in Pennsylvania, when they first got started, it was a lot of Quakers coming in who are looking at that as a religious haven. And after that wave of Quakers, more and more it was just Protestants who were coming into Pennsylvania to live in Philadelphia. Eventually Pittsburgh will be settled on the other side of the state. A lot of small farmers in between, and you'll have waves of people coming over during the wars that happen in Europe. And when it comes to a choice for colonists, a lot of them will move to the middle colonies, because in the southern colonies, you're either a rich plantation owner or else you're just a poor white person who's stuck in the back country, or you're an African slave. In New England, you could go to Rhode Island and fight tolerance, but that's a small place. But in Massachusetts and other places, you've got a lot of really religiously intolerant people. So places like New York and Pennsylvania become pretty attractive, even though a lot of the land is gobbled up by rich people once they get their colony started. The next question, what did the Anabaptists do and what was their significance? So Anabaptists, in your textbook, sometimes are referred to as the Presbyterians. And a Presbyterian is strictly just a religious group that believes in having their elders be the leaders inside the church. And it's something that was popular in Scotland. And so you had a bunch of these Scotch Presbyterians coming to America, and what they believe in is they're Calvinists. They are very much believing in John Calvin's viewpoint of predestination, that you need grace and salvation. And so that's going to be their perspective when they come over to America, is they very much are similar to the Puritans in their viewpoint of what the afterlife looks like. So getting to the next question, was it the Presbyterians, the ones that believe God was universal and that people are already determined to if they're going to heaven or hell? That's definitely one of the groups that feels that way. The Puritans and the Pilgrims are also Calvinists who feel that same way. The next question I see here is asking about the difference between the Great Ice Age that started 2 million years ago and the Ice Age that began 35,000 years ago. And what I want you to think about is we had a series of ice ages from that 2 million mark all the way up to about 11,000 years ago, and they came in waves. And so we would have an ice age, and then we would have a shorter period in between, which would be the inter period of ice ages, where we would have what we have now, a warmer period where the ice ages have stopped, and then another ice age would resume. So that 2 million number is when they first were recorded and started. And then up until about 11,000 years ago is when we still saw them repeating themselves quite heavily. The next question asks, who were the Cahokia and what was their significance? The Cahokia was that Native American group that was in the center of the United States by St. Louis in Illinois. And what we discussed with them was they were one of the groups that showed you that there was complexity, sophistication, major trade routes, because they had trade between the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Gulf of Mexico, and they had evidence showing that they were trading across that entire distance. It was also the civilization that was gone by the time the Europeans arrived, and they speculate about why they had disappeared, whether it was like wood that was cut down or food problems or other sorts of things, but they don't really know because they were gone by the time that the Europeans arrived in North America. They're significant, though, because they do show you that there was Native Americans here who were practicing a much more advanced sort of civilization structure than what oftentimes stereotypical people will give Indians credit for, as describing them as just nomadic plains Indians. They were doing something significantly more. Your next question, the encomienda system that the Spanish had, allowed them to take control of the land and rule the natives, or just gave them power over the natives? The first part of that is correct. So when you think about the encomienda system, a conquistador controls all of their designated chunk of land and any people who live inside of that. What's influencing them is very much the feudal system that you learn about, where over in Europe they had practiced that, but even more so, they're being deeply influenced by what they've seen happening with plantation life, especially with slaves. And so they're very much of that same mindset that they have control over the people, and nobody can question them for what they're up to. And the hope is that they're behaving the way that they should, but sometimes they were not. The next question I see here: what is the Treaty of Tordesillas? Remember, that was the treaty that was created by the Pope when Portugal and Spain started exploring simultaneously. Portugal started first and took over large chunks of Africa, but then they were passed really quickly by the Spanish, who had more money and more technology. And so the Spanish started conquering huge chunks of area with their conquistadors. But since both were Catholic, they went to the Pope for a decision on who got what. And so the Treaty of Tordesillas created a line that divided up the Americas, so that anything to the east of that line would belong to the Portuguese, and to the west of that line would belong to the Spanish. Unfortunately for the Portuguese, all that left them was some islands and the tip of Brazil, so they were able to have Brazil as their colony. But largely everything else in Latin America became Spanish. What are the key differences to note between Puritans and Protestants? The way to look at it is think about being a Protestant as being like human in this case, and being a Puritan or a Pilgrim would be like being male or female, where you're still a human being, but you're just a different gender in the conversation that we're having. So for the Protestants, a Protestant is anybody who is a Christian, but they disagree with the Catholic Church about the way that they were operating during the period right after the Middle Ages, during the Reformation. And so there was a protest that was going on that is still ongoing as that church remains Christian, but not Catholic. And so when we take a look at the Puritans were a group of Protestants who followed John Calvin's viewpoint of predestination. And so they had a much different interpretation than, let's say, the Lutherans or the Anglicans, who had different views on the path towards salvation. Let me see. The next question says, if a colony is a royal colony, does that just mean it is under the control of the English government? Pretty much. So typically what will happen is, with the joint stock companies like Jamestown, when it was first started, there weren't British agents that were inside the colony. Instead, there were representatives of the business who were there, who were trying to make a profit for their company. Like John Smith would have been somebody who was working to try to figure out how to get wealth out of the colony, until he realized that they were resorting to cannibalism and having all sorts of problems. Lord Delaware was the same sort of thing. Eventually, when they became a royal colony, the king is going to kick out the Virginia Company. He's going to make it their own colony, and he's going to send over a royal governor, perhaps even a military force, and he's going to take much more interest in trying to control the colony itself. What you're going to see, though, is like in Virginia, even though they became a royal colony, Governor Berkeley wasn't interested in trying to pressure rich people to change their behavior, because he was getting really rich by helping the colony stay peaceful and export tobacco. And so that's why he was willing to work with the plantation owners to crush Bacon's rebellion, because that way the planters stay in control, he stays in control, nobody gets angry, there's no need to change the situation, and he still keeps getting rich. So it kind of depends on a case-by-case basis, because you also saw royal colony emerge with the Dominion of New England, and that didn't work out great for anybody, where Edmund Andros wiped out all of the charters, and that ended up leading to a lot of tension and backlash. So the next question, what was the fundamental order established in 1639? The fundamental orders of Connecticut are going to be the constitutional rules that are created by the people of Connecticut to govern themselves. You see a number of these being created, and so the big two that I would point out is the Mayflower Compact and the Fundamental Orders, and both of them are showing you that there's an impulse with the colonists to have independent government of their own, because they are so far away from the king. That also shows they like the idea of having a written piece of paper that says all the rules for the colony, so you understand what the rules are, but then you also understand what the rules aren't. And so if there's a governor or something that tries to add in new rules later, a lot of these colonists will refer back to their original paperwork and point out, you can't create new rules. In our Constitution, in our charter, in our fundamental orders, it says this is what the colonial rules are going to be. And so from the earliest time, a lot of these guys are playing around with independence, and they like that. So when we eventually have periods where salutary neglect is taken away, like under the Dominion of New England, you're going to have a lot of these colonists start pushing back because they've experimented with independence and they like it. When was the first colony established? I'm not sure if you're referring to Spanish or British or which one you're referring to. So if we talk about the Spanish, you've already seen Columbus's arrival and Cortez's interaction with the Aztecs. If we're talking about the British, it would have been Roanoke, where they planted a colony on the island off the coast of North Carolina. But the one that's been longest lasting for the British is Jamestown. If you're talking about the longest lasting established city in the colonies created by Europeans, that would be St. Augustine, Florida, by the Spanish. So you've got different groups competing in different parts of the country, but I think that might be what you're driving towards. Let me see here. The next question I see here is, what was the 30 Years' War and what was its significance? The 30 Years' War was in the middle of the 1600s, and think about like a world war to get an idea of what the 30 Years' War is up to. It's a war that involves a huge chunk of European countries fighting in Central Europe. And with this war, you're having a lot of people who are being mobilized. There's drafts going on. There are people who are getting rolled up in this conflict. And this is causing a lot of people to flee from Europe, looking for places to go to, because they don't want to get rolled up in these conflicts. They would like to take off. But the 30 Years' War is going to be a major conflict that breaks out, one of many that we'll be studying, especially when we move to Chapter 5, as we start talking about the European conflicts that start drifting over here. It says, why did England and the Spanish go to war? And it's going to happen repeatedly, so I'm hoping I'm choosing the right one you're discussing. Remember, 1588, the Spanish Armada is going to get destroyed while they were on a quest to conquer England, in part because they were commanded to take on this Protestant country and bring them back to the Catholic faith. For the Spanish and the British, they will war repeatedly in the upcoming chapters as they try to have dominance out in the ocean for whose colonies are better and who controls the Atlantic. Next question says, the middle colonies had wheat cultivation and the south had tobacco and sugar and also indigo. What did the north have? The north is going to have a bunch of different things. They're going to have very small farms, but their farms are going to be limited by the fact that they've got really cold climates, kind of like our own, where they don't have as long of a growing season as the south. And they've got rocky soil because of the climate and because of the ice ages and whatever. They're not in the same situation soil-wise as the south, so they have small farms, but then they also are supplementing that with trade, fishing, ship production, timber, a whole host of different things. And so they've got a very diverse economic system, which is going to make it very easy for them to do things like give up slavery, because it's just one of many things they're doing, and they could easily redefine an African person as being a low-wage worker if they're not a slave anymore. In the Deep South, obviously, since they're totally tied to that system, they're in trouble when they try to move away from that system. Next question asks about John Winthrop and the City on a Hill. I think I got that. If you feel like that's still shaky, feel free to post whatever clarification you need. But essentially, it's the idea that their whole job is to advance God's mission and the Puritan faith throughout the rest of the world, and for their community to be a beacon to the rest of the world so they can see what a good religious group looks like. Your problem, though, obviously, is like we learned about today. Once you get to the late 1600s, you've got the Halfway Covenant, you've got Salem, you've got this influx of immigrants. And so for a lot of these Puritans, they feel like things are slipping, and they don't want them to. And so it's causing tensions as we move further and further away from their foundation. The next question asks about mercantilism. And so mercantilism is super simple. The way to imagine mercantilism is, just keep in mind, with mercantilism, the only reason why colonies are created is to make the mother country wealthy. That's mercantilism. It's just the idea that you're pulling all the wealth you can out of that country that is a colony of yours, And what we're going to see with the British is they're going to enforce that by saying that the colonies will be good for making raw materials. And then in England is where they're going to be making finished materials. So they're trying to figure out how to get the cheap materials out of America to build stuff, turn it into something cool, and then sell it back to the Americans. So whatever wealth the Americans make for like creating tobacco, they're hoping to get all that money out of them in trade for manufactured goods from England. So the idea is that the colonies are supposed to stay poor as they export wealth to the rich. What's going to be problematic, though, is people in America have an independent streak, and they don't want to do this because they would like to get rich themselves. They're becoming more capitalistic in this mercantilist system. It says here, which native tribe was by Carolina when they had Georgia as a buffer and had Spanish in the South? There's tons of them. You've got the Cherokee, you've got the Seminoles, you've got a number of other groups, the Creek and so on, that are located down in the southern part of the United States. And so it's not just one. There are many that are very much being encouraged by the Spanish to go and attack the British colonists because it's that middle ground again. The Spanish can work with the Spanish to attack the British, or vice versa. The British could try to work with the Native Americans, but unfortunately for the Native Americans, they were abused so badly by the British. Rarely do they want to join them in fighting the Spanish as much as the opposite way around. Let me see here. Is the idea that North colonies are free and South had slavery true? Like I was mentioning just a second ago, it's kind of true. It'll be more true once we get past the American Revolution. For the time being, the northern states have far fewer slaves than the southern states, but you also have a gigantic slave trade going in places like Boston and New York and other sorts of northern cities where they're bringing in slaves off of ships, trading them, and then they're moving to the deep south after they get traded to their plantation owners. And there are some slaves that are working in the middle and New England states to try to help out with production, although in much fewer numbers than you'll find in a place like the Carolinas and so on. Let's see here. What was the first colony that was formed by the people of Barbados? They're being attracted to the Carolinas, and so especially South Carolina is going to be the place that was really drawing those individuals in. Why did the Wampanoag partner with the Pilgrims? The reason why they're teaming up with them is because they've got enemies on all sides of them, and so they're going to form an alliance to fight against the other Native American groups that are seen as a threat by the Wampanoag. What's going to happen, though, is the Native Americans aren't blind. They know the Pilgrims who are there are a threat. They just believe that the other neighboring tribes are more of a threat, and they're hoping to navigate that as well as they can. Let me see here. Can you explain the triangular trade? Absolutely. So when you think about the triangular trade, you've got Africa, you've got America, you've got the Caribbean, you've got England. And so when you take a look at the map inside your textbook, you'll see triangles like from Africa to the Indies up to America and back to Africa. Or you'll see another one that goes from the Africa to America up to England and then down. And so there's a series of trade routes that are going on, and the goal is to get natural resources back to England in mercantilism so that they can turn them into finished goods and make money. There's a goal to try to get even less refined goods from the West Indies to America, kind of like molasses, where it can be turned into rum that can then be used in the slave trade. And then there's also the movement to get slaves out of Africa and across the ocean to places where they'll be used as workers, and they can be spread anywhere into South, Central, North America, the Caribbean, any other places that might need workers. And so it's just an ongoing trade that's bouncing across the Atlantic Ocean between all those different places. Let's see here. For the second yellow packet, what is the significance of 1607 to 1754? Really good question. So 1607 is going to be the start of Jamestown. So this is indicating for you that the Virginia colony is where they wanted to begin. They see Roanoke as kind of just an outlier where it didn't work out, but it didn't stop British people from coming over. So it's a nice piece of trivia, but it's not something we spend tons of time on. 1754 is the start of the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, even though you're going to see that it goes 9 years here inside the United States. But the French and Indian War is going to be 1754, and it's at that point that we move into a third period where we start taking a look at the American Revolution and the impact that it had. From the French and Indian War forward, we're going to see that there's just a path that goes on as we start moving closer and closer to independence. Let me see here. What did the Dutch do that was important? They did a number of different things that were important. Number one, they were a gigantic trading country, second only to the British in their trade networks that they build up. As a result, they want to have colonies over here in the New World so they can get natural resources, start building up industry so they can keep up with the British. And that's what New Netherlands is with New Amsterdam, which is fine until the British get fed up with that and they wipe it out, largely because they want to take out a main competitor who is trying to keep up with them in the mercantilist trade. As the British are trying to figure out if they can squash this colony, maybe they can freeze out the Dutch and weaken them quite a bit. Let me see here. When New England started, what type of economy did they have? And so when you think about New England, they're going to be starting off as small farmers and also subsistence farmers growing the food that they need, but not a lot of extra crops that they're sending outside the country. They're on the shoreline, so they can also raise fish. And they're working on like timber, and they're starting to get involved in trade, and so they've got a very diverse economy from the very beginning, and it just keeps growing and growing, especially since they're in urban places. More and more stuff can then be fostered in that environment. You can have blacksmiths, you can have tailors, you can have other sorts of people who have skills that emerge in a city environment that you don't have in the South. So you'll notice that one of the slides that I showed you mentioned that in the South, they don't have many professionals during this time period. You're either a farmer, either small or large plantation, or else you're one of the few traders that are on the coastline, but otherwise there aren't a lot of options that are there. So the next question is asking what are the Gullah? And they are descendants of enslaved Africans that were able to free themselves in places in Georgia and South Carolina along the coastal areas down there. And so this is going to be a group of Creole individuals who are adopting the cultures of both the country they've come to and also then the place where they came from. Next question, do we have to know much about the dates? Dates OD when things occurred? If so, what are the main ones? The best way I can put this is not going to be a test where it says to you the year that this event took place was blah. It's going to be a lot of questions that are asking you to know the main point. And so as far as knowing specific years, it's not vitally important. The reason why we focus on the years so much, though, is when you're writing a free-form essay, you're going to need to be able to do chronological reasoning where you're able to say this came first, this came second, this came third, and so on. And so the quicker you get that locked in, understanding that Jamestown came first, then the Pilgrims in 1620, followed closely by the Great Puritan Migration in 1630, the more you can do stuff like that, the better off your writing is going to be, because then you'll actually know step 1 leads to step 2 leads to step 3. But also, if that's something that's tricky for you, it's going to get better as the year goes on, and you're never going to be perfect with it this year. Nobody expects a freshman in college to be locked in with all their dates and have them knocked out chronologically in sequence. But the better you can get with that stuff, the better off you'll be. Let me see here. What is Chapter 4, please? I'm not certain what that means, other than Chapter 4 is after the initial foundation of the colonies, the description of how the Chesapeake and New England developed over time, since there are two most important colonies to be able to compare contrast. And so they talk an awful lot about their similarities and even more so about their differences. What were the key turning points during the time period that we are studying? That's a really tricky question when you're asking about thousands of years put together. And so you learned about the Native Americans in Chapter 1. And obviously their turning point is when Europeans started encountering them and changing the way that they were living. For the Europeans, you saw a turning point going on with the Cortez interacting with the Aztecs, but then also the Spanish Armada in 1588, which led to the rise of the British and the decline of the Spanish. For the British, you saw them establishing colonies throughout the time period, but then also you saw that there were turning points in the Chesapeake and New England with either Bacon's Rebellion or the Halfway Covenant or Salem trials, which shows that there's some tensions that are emerging in those colonies. So that's some of the turning points, and I'm hoping that's what you're looking for, but I'm not certain if I'm going to the depth that you want. The next question, what was the Columbian Exchange? Columbian Exchange is just all the things that the Europeans were bringing over, whether it was products or diseases or innovations or ideas, and then things that the Native Americans sent back across the ocean, like corn or potatoes, or ideas about how to live here in the New World or whatever. That transmission of stuff is known as the Columbian Exchange, where they're sharing things back and forth across the ocean. Where did the Mayflower, let me see here, where did the Mayflower Compact end up? I'm not sure if that means the piece of paper. So let me take a look. It says here the original Mayflower Compact has been lost, and so they don't know where that went. But as far as the Mayflower Compact, if the question is asking where did it apply, that was the Pilgrims at Plymouth that were setting up their Mayflower Compact as their governing document to explain what the rules of the colony were going to be. Next question, what are the key distinctions between the different major religions prominent in the colonies? So if we start with the Chesapeake, they're Anglicans, but they're not extremely religious Anglicans, but they intensely hate Catholics, Jewish people, and atheists. And you see that in Maryland, that tries to be a Catholic haven. But even those Catholics are not tolerant of Jews or atheists, and so there's hostility going on there. But when Protestants come into Maryland, they're going to start oppressing the Catholics and not being very nice to them. In the southern states, they were typically Anglican, but not super religious compared to the people in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, they are Pilgrims on the coast at Plymouth, and they're Puritans in Massachusetts Bay, and the Puritan faith is the one that ends up being dominant until it starts declining at the end of the 1600s, and then we'll see it splinter as we move into Chapter 5 with something called the Great Awakening. We'll find there are other religions that are established as well. You have toleration in Rhode Island, so you've got a place for people to be able to practice their religion freely. You also have New York, which is incredibly diverse with a bunch of different religions that are there. And then finally, you've got the Quakers in Pennsylvania. So there's a lot of religious diversity that's spread out throughout the colonies. What is the Spanish caste system? When you hear about a caste system, that just means a class system, and it's really rigid, so it's very hard to move up or down in that society, and a lot of it can be based on things like your race, your skin color, your blood, whatever. For the Spanish, their caste system was very much determined by how much Spanish blood you had inside your ancestry. So even if most people were mixed race, if you had more dominance of Spanish blood, that could lead to a higher rank inside of society. Next question, what dates do you need to know? I think I mentioned that pretty thoroughly just a second ago. And so if you still are having questions about like if a specific event merits that, you can ask. But like I mentioned, the test isn't like that. It's not like, give me the year, like give you a description of an event and ask you what year it took place. It's instead, do you know the main ideas that you're reading from your textbook? And that's going to be much more important. It says here, what are the point of blue laws? You've had some blue laws in the state that you may not have been aware of. So a blue law is a law that is created not to keep you safe from injury like murder. Instead, they're meant to keep your soul safe. So like for the longest time up until this past year, you couldn't buy alcohol in the state of Minnesota on a Sunday because that was a blue law. So even though it isn't something that's stopping a murder from happening, it was decided that on Sundays it would be inappropriate for liquor stores to be open selling alcohol. And just this past year, they decided to repeal that and allow people to sell alcohol on Sundays if they would like to. So that's what you see some of the colonies doing, is not just legislating about things that keep your body safe, but also to keep your soul safe. Next question, what is antinomianism? It's the idea that you can interpret God's message internally in your soul based on just your interpretations of religion and your connections with God. It's what the Quakers believed, and it caused them a lot of problems because it made them really radical, because nobody could really threaten them because God could speak to them inside their soul. It's the thing that gets Anne Hutchinson exiled because she believes the same thing, that she has a connection with God that she alone can work out in her own way, and other people can do the same. So it's very much a radical sort of viewpoint compared to the Puritans, who want to have control over what direction their religion is going. It says, what useful aspects did Europeans and Native Americans adopt from each other? They traded with one another products, whether it's metal products going from the Europeans to the Native Americans, or other tools or technologies that are being brought over by the Europeans. They also bring over livestock with them and foods that the Native Americans had never seen. And obviously, Native Americans had corn, and they had potatoes, and they had furs, and they had aid initially when the colonists were struggling, and they had knowledge of the area. And so there was a trade that was going on between the two to try to help both sides be able to handle their situation. Says, what is the encomienda system? And the encomienda system is just the system we talked about last week, where the Spanish would give a conquistador a chunk of land, and any people or resources that were on or in that land were then the conquistadors do with as he pleased, with the ultimate objective of being able to spread Christianity, but then also to bring back as much gold and silver to Spain as possible to make their country as strong as they possibly could. Next question says, what were the benefits to the Spanish, and why is the black legend wrong? It's just an argument that's made by historians that want you to make sure that you're keeping balance when you take a look at what the Spanish are up to. And so it's totally legitimate to notice the torture and the abuse and all sorts of things that are done to the Native Americans when the Spanish arrive. But it also is then, if that's all that you focus on, it very much ignores the technologies that are being brought over, whether it's the metallurgy or whether it's the other sorts of innovations, pots, pans, that sort of stuff, or the interactions with their society that creates a culture that becomes the mixed culture that we have nowadays. Just treating that as strictly evil, bad things that happen, are ignoring the historically complex things that are taking place, that has a civilization that has emerged where we are today. And many people south of our country have experiences based on the fact that that's their background, for good or for bad. Let me see here. How did mestizos and intermarriage between Europeans and Indians change Indian culture? Obviously, you're introducing then two cultures that are merging together into one. And so as a result, you're having a lot of Spanish influence being brought into settlements, especially since they become the dominant culture. And so they start getting rid of native religious sites and building cathedrals in their place, spreading Catholicism, changing the work patterns and structure, sometimes forcing the Native Americans to change their behaviors as a result. And so there's a huge impact that they're going to have, especially since with intermarriage, you're going to have people of blended backgrounds who have ties to both sides. And so it's going to create a more complex situation as they move forward. It says, what was William Bradford's significance? William Bradford was the governor of Plymouth Bay Colony, Plymouth Colony, where he is the one who is instrumental in creating the Mayflower Compact, and he's also the one who is instrumental in the first few years of getting the colony established and up and running. And so that's the reason why he's notable. He does an awful lot of writing to describe what the time period was like, and that's also why he gains a lot of notoriety. Besides Pennsylvania being Quaker, what other religions were in the middle colonies? Tons of them. And so when you take a look at New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, they are a place that has much more religious tolerance because there isn't the official religion like you see going on with the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so you've got a lot of diversity, especially in the urban areas where you have a lot of mixing of religions, especially after the first initial settlements take place. But especially like a place like New York, they just got tons of different people coming in who aren't Dutch, who are just there to trade. And so that's the religious piece is much less emphasized than it would be in a place like Massachusetts. Is King Philip's War a good example of Native Americans defending their political and religious beliefs? Absolutely. The attempt to build a confederacy to try to figure out ways to defend themselves against the Europeans who are encroaching in their territory would be a great one to talk about. Says, what about Newfoundland? What about Newfoundland? I don't know what that question is. So just let me know if you have something else you want me to talk about with Newfoundland. If you're just giving a shout out, I agree. What about them? They're killer. Next question: did men look down on their wives in the North versus in the South? How did that compare to how they viewed slaves and the white trash? Um, it's tricky because, like, when you talk about did men look down on women, if we took women from today's society and put them into the culture back then, you would feel very much dominated by the lack of decision making compared to the men inside your family. If you asked women of the time period, though, for many of them, that was their normal. And if we think about our society nowadays, there are a lot of things that we ask men and women to do, or things that they do in their relationships, that are just normal in our society. Even though if you looked at it as an outsider, it would seem very unfair in one direction or another. So I would be careful with the idea of did men look down on their wives? I think they just considered them wives in the traditional sense that men and women had different roles, and while they worked together on the farm, it was understood that men had certain legal status advantages that women did not have, especially in like the northern colonies. And for most people, that was the accepted way of doing things. Just like nowadays, you had no women in your life who are challenging the mainstream understanding of what women should be like nowadays compared to traditional ideas. You still had them back then, but just like nowadays, that's not the majority. Most women back then, like now, are willing to stick with a lot of the norms that society has, even if it does create advantages or disadvantages. As far as how that compares to how they viewed slaves and people who they would consider white trash or like freedmen in the indentured servant system, I would say that it's much more discriminatory with those groups where upper class people throughout the colonies are going to be looking at the people who are indentured servants and seeing them as disposable, where they don't really care about them much at all. And when it comes to Africans, a lot of people who don't own slaves are willing to accept the excuses of slave owners that they're doing a good thing for slaves, because they never end up seeing what those plantations look like, because they're in another part of the country. And so it's kind of an ignorance that's going on about what's happening on some of those deep woods plantations in the Carolinas, but there's still slavery going on throughout the rest of the colonies, and some of that can be quite brutal, even in the North. So I think they're aware of what's taking place. Was fishing a big part of the economy, or was the economy just based on farms and plantations? So I'm assuming that this question is about the South. And so in the South, you do end up having some fishing and other sorts of things. They are cutting down trees. They are doing subsistence farming with crops. And so we can't detail everybody who's making cash. But for the most part, when you think about the South, if people are looking at making a good amount of money, they're doing it through tobacco production or rice and indigo down in the Carolinas. And that's the normal. Up in New England, where you need to be much more diverse, you have a much more booming fishing production. And what's going to happen is those fishing boats are going to start moving up and down the coastline, and so they can go all the way out in the ocean. They can go all the way up and down the eastern seaboard. And especially once we get into the 1800s, they'll start whaling and go all the way across the ocean, chasing whales and whatever. And so that becomes the normal for them. What specific Native American tribes helped Cortez capture Tenochtitlan? I don't know. It's beyond the level of knowledge needed for your survey course, but it would be super easy to Google search that. And so you might want to take a look at that, but I can guarantee you that question won't be on your next test. Was Salem a one-time thing, or did it happen multiple times? You had different outbreaks of witch concerns happening in the Massachusetts colony, but this was by far the biggest and the most out of control. It took on a life of its own. They started bringing in famous preachers from other parts of Massachusetts to try to figure out how to sort this thing out. And it really took off and got crazy, where they were accusing a lot of people of being witches. And once they started accusing people who the rich and the powerful knew weren't witches, that led them to want to defuse the whole thing. What did the Native Americans trade with the Spanish and English in exchange for metal and guns? It depended on the situation. They could trade food, they could trade furs, they could trade other sorts of resources that they might have accumulated. So it really is on a case-by-case basis, depending on which Native American groups you're referring to. Some of the times the trade will also be to turn over title for land, where they're told, if you want to give up this chunk of land, we'll give you this stuff. And for a group of Native Americans who didn't quite understand the concept of owning what they consider to be sacred, that caused a culture clash that was pretty big. What were New York and New Jersey founded? Why were they founded, and what were they known for? New York was a trading company established by the Dutch, conquered by the British. New Jersey was given away as a land grant, and then you also had New Sweden that was out there too for a heartbeat until they were conquered by the Dutch, who then were conquered by the British. For those two colonies, New York is by far the much more important compared to New Jersey. New Jersey isn't going to be all that vitally important because they follow New York's lead all the way up until the American Revolution. Will the test questions tomorrow be in chronological order? Pretty much. I mean, it's going to be segments of the test will be divided up by chapters. So you'll get all your chapter 1 questions done, then chapter 2, then chapter 3, then chapter 4. So you won't be leaping around from chapter to chapter. What was the point of splitting New Jersey, and why was it reunified? It was initially granted to a group of nobles, and it was subdivided in that way. And then they had all sorts of problems because they wanted to sell land. But then they had a bunch of squatters who were just sneaking in and not paying for their land. And then when they'd send out collectors, they would get harassed and driven back. And so it turned into a real mess for the people who tried to use this as a way to make cash. And so that's the reason for the divisions and reunifications and all that sort of stuff. So essentially you've got squatters who are farming in the area, and it's not nearly as important as New York as far as being a dominant middle colony. Let me see here. Were the convicted witches mostly poor women or women with economic power? They were typically women who were older, who were living alone, who were very much seen as outcasts in their society, and it became very easy to pick them out and pick on them. And so kind of like we see in a lot of issues, where if you're looking for a scapegoat, it's pretty easy to find one if you're willing to attack people who are pretty vulnerable, and that's what you see happening there. What were the navigation laws? The navigation laws are laws that are being created by the British to enforce mercantilism. And what navigation laws means is they're either putting taxes onto certain goods or else trying to get them traded through their colonies. And so they'll set up certain rules for how trade is supposed to take place. For the most part, though, the navigation laws can be ignored because in the colonies during salutary neglect, there would be a tax collector and a royal governor, but you could bribe them pretty easily. During the period of the Dominion of New England, though, with Edmund Andros, though, you had a huge crackdown take place, and it's during those periods that tension rise, because the colonists were okay with having the navigation laws as long as they weren't enforced strictly. As soon as they are, that makes them super mad. The House of Burgesses is being asked about next. And that's just the legislature, the Congress that's created in Virginia to help the people of Virginia govern themselves so that they can make decisions locally. And that becomes the way that they like to do things from that point forward. Let me see here. What were Muslim Moors? What does it mean to be a middleman? And what is, let me see here. And what is a bishop? Are Muslim Moors middlemen? What is Sweden's anemic colony? Okay, so I see a lot of stuff happening here. So first of all, a Moor is another term for an African person, and so when they talk about the Moors who are coming out of Africa, those are the people who invaded into Spain and conquered them before Ferdinand and Isabella united their families and drove the Moors out of Spain. Eventually, then that's going to lead to the rise of Spain as a nation state and their expansion. What is a bishop? A bishop is a higher level authority in the Catholic Church, or else in another. I mean, Protestants have bishops as well in some cases. So a bishop is higher than a priest. And then as you move up, you can have archbishops and cardinals and whatever. And so there's different levels of religious people. And so I think that's what you're referencing. When you ask, are Muslim Moors middlemen? Anybody can be a middleman. And so what they're pointing out to you is in the Crusades, you had all these products coming from Asia that were then being passed through the hands of middlemen. So these are people who would take stuff from Asia, then they would move it through their territory to send it to Europe. And as a result, they would then also increase the price of that product because it was going through their territory and they were carrying it for a period of time. So when you talk about are they a middleman, they're the ones who are middlemen for products from Asia, and the Europeans don't like paying the extra money for those products, so they're going to try to find a different way to get to Asia so they can bypass all those middlemen. As far as what was Sweden's anemic colony, that was New Sweden that we talked about that was near New York until the Dutch conquered that during the period that they were still here in the Americas. What is a conquistador? That's the military explorers that the Spanish were sending off to try to explore the New World. How are the slave codes brought over from Barbados different from the original slave codes? They're interrelated with one another, and so with the slave codes, they're very much stealing from one another's ideas, with the idea that black people can't read, they can't write, they can't travel freely, all the stuff that you'll probably remember from being back in middle school when they talked about slavery. That's what those slave codes are putting into place. Why was Bacon's Rebellion so important? Like we talked about yesterday, Bacon's Rebellion was an uprising by a bunch of former indentured servants, and when they attacked the plantation owners for not protecting them against the Native Americans, they're indicating that there's a huge number of angry, poor people who feel like the rich people are taking advantage of them. And when they lose that revolution, the planters are going to figure out ways to keep them in a place where they are not going to be moving up because they're seen as dangerous. So we're going to move away from indentured servitude, and we're going to move to slavery as a result of that. What useful aspects did Europeans and Native Americans adopt from each other? I didn't hear you answer that question. I think I hit it just a little bit ago. So remember, they're exchanging like metallurgy, furs, crops, information about the local area, anything that they can trade back and forth to each other, especially if you take a look at that Columbian Exchange chart, you'll be able to see the different things that they're passing back and forth to one another. Are questions on the test detail specific or more general concept? Like if we don't have every detail of each chapter memorized, is it okay? It's really hard to answer that question. These are going to be really nitpicky multiple choice questions, so they're pretty detail oriented. The best way I can answer you is if you've done your practice tests like I told you to from your green book and from your end of chapter quizzes, they should be giving you an indication right now when you're doing them without notes if you're close enough to finding success with those sorts of things. And if you're not, then you obviously have things that you need to keep reviewing. Similar to the question about key dates, are there any significant native tribes on the test that we need to know about? Yes, you need to have looked at that study chart from chapter 1 and identified from your textbook which ones seem to be the most important Native American groups that seem to be getting the most attention. There's not going to be a ton of questions on the test about them, but that's definitely fair game. Why are the middle colonies considered the most American part of America? I don't know that I would describe it that way. If your textbook manufacturer does, that's okay. I would refer to it more as just a blend of the Chesapeake and New England, where they're getting influenced by both. And as a result, you're ending up with a very much Americanized place that is getting influenced by two different sides and ending up with a melting pot of different ideas there. What specific tribes should we know more strongly about? I think I just hit that just a second ago. Chapter 2 review answer key said Newfoundland was the first attempt at colonization, and you said it was Roanoke a couple of minutes ago. Clarify. I understand what you're asking about. What we were talking about at the time was the British attempts to colonize or the Spanish. When they talk about Newfoundland, they're talking about the Vikings who made a very small attempt to land here in the New World, and then very quickly they were driven out by the natives who were in the area. And so that attempt was a temporary sort of settlement that never was really one of those permanent settlements that we think of with colonization. And so when you take a look at that answer key, it's true. But as far as for my purposes, I never find that we end up writing about that. In our U.S. history course, it's more like a trivia piece. And it's very much more important to get to like the Spanish and the British and what they're up to with colonization. Were there any other male victims of the Salem witch trials other than John Proctor? I don't know. Super easy to Google search, though. I believe you can find all the names of all the people and the 2 dogs, most likely, that were hung or otherwise tortured and killed. But unfortunately, I don't know that answer. What made Queen Elizabeth an unusually successful leader? The fact that she was female, first of all. She was able to take England from a position where they were in danger with the 1588 invasion, and she, during her lifetime, was able to build them up into a superpower with a navy, gigantic colonies, and all sorts of things going right for Britain, she was not what Henry VIII wanted, but she ended up becoming a really good leader nonetheless. Are test questions about specific people, and if so, who are the most important people you need to know? From 4 chapters, we've run through during our review session a lot of the names that could pop up as test questions, but I can't run through every name that would possibly pop up. How did the Native Americans retaliate towards the British during first colonization? You saw battles taking place against them. You saw like the First and Second Powhatan War or the Pequot Wars, where you had battles going on between the Native Americans and the Europeans, but largely the Native Americans are going to lose out because of disease, and they're going to get overwhelmed by the numbers that the British have building up. What was the significance of Connecticut? Largely we want to focus on the fundamental orders of Connecticut and that governmental structure they build that is going to allow them to have a constitutional form of government. What was the point of bribing tax collectors? It seems that you were losing money either way. Pocketing taxes seemed much more profitable. Your problem, though, is the tax collectors, if they get no money, then it's going to be obvious that they are not doing their job and they're going to get replaced. And so as a smuggler, you have the choice of either trying to run past the tax collectors, then they become your enemies and they have a reason to crack down on you, especially if the king ends salutary neglect. If, on the other hand, you're paying a bribe or else doing other sorts of things like that, you might be able to pay less in taxes while still paying them and keeping the tax collector happy, which means you're not paying the full amount, but you also don't have an enemy from the government who's trying to take you out. And so that's where a lot of them are coming from. Is the test tomorrow kind of similar to the yellow packet or the green study guide book? Much more like the green study guide book. That yellow packet is very much about getting you guys your handouts that are done so that you're able to review the key concepts that will pop up on the AP test in the spring. So we do them at the time that material is fresh to help you review and also understand what are the big things that you have to take away from each chapter. But it's those green practice quizzes and end of chapter quizzes that'll help you out the most because they're very much aligned with what the AP test, what your multiple choice test is going to look like. So let me take a look here. Let me see. I see what were the main religions in the South, largely Anglican. But again, remember, in the South, it's very much less of a concern about being religious. So you could be super religious on your plantation, but they don't have large cities. They're largely there for plantation efforts to make as much cash as they can. I do not see any more questions. That doesn't mean that you might not have more questions, and so you can feel free to stop by either before school or else you can stop by during passing time and ask a question if you need to. Typically, I don't answer questions that a kid will come up and say, something that they stole from another kid earlier in the day and ask about a specific question like that. But if you've got groups or whatever you want to know about, I can help out with those. We've had two questions that popped up. What was the Iroquois Confederacy again? Remember, that was the Native American Confederacy that was going on in the northeastern United States, where the Iroquois realized that there was strength in numbers. So they united with a group of other Native American groups to increase the strength of their tribes compared to their neighbors. Also says here, what is a charter and what does it do? Because if it gives them the okay to have land or something, then what happens to the people when it's taken? A charter is just a document from the King of England that says that there is now a deal made between the king and these individuals that you get to live in this place as still being a member of English society. It says what the rules are that you need to follow inside the colony, what protections you have. And for a lot of the colonists, they treat these almost like constitutions too, where it lays out specifically what you can and cannot do in this new place in a new world. As far as what happens with land or something to people when they take it back, I'm not sure that I'm following what that means, other than the fact that the king is not stepping in and saying who can or can't buy land. But the king definitely has the right to take away your land if he wants to, but that's just picking a fight with somebody, especially with the king who doesn't really care what's happening in South Carolina. He's going to allow them to do whatever the heck they want to, as long as they're sending money back to Europe mercantilism style. So that he'll leave a lot of those problems to the royal governor and let him sort stuff out, or the local legislature during periods of salutary neglect. Finally, we've got a question asking about the Act of Toleration. You'll remember that was in Maryland, where the leaders, Lord Baltimore, George and Cecil Calvert, created this Act of Toleration that said that Catholics and Protestants were all fine inside that colony. Jews and atheists were not, under penalty of death, but it was trying to be more tolerant religiously than what they had been experiencing back home in Europe. But that Act of Toleration eventually is going to be wiped out because more Protestants start moving in and that Catholic haven idea kind of slips by the wayside. We've got a question here. Can I explain encomienda? We did that about 20 minutes ago, but to remind you of the encomienda system, that is a system where a conquistador gets a chunk of land, and any resources or people who are on that land are his to govern and control, kind of like what you saw with the feudal system back in Europe, but also especially like you saw with the plantation system growing up with the Portuguese and the Spanish when they were settling off in the islands of the New World. Says here, what's the significance of Delaware? Not much for your test tomorrow. We discussed how it was close to the Chesapeake, influenced by them, but very much minor compared to them. Was King Philip's War about Native Americans trying to keep their way of life from the Europeans? I feel like we're going back to questions that we answered about a half hour ago, so if you're just dipping in right now, you may want to check the video because that was already covered. And so for King Philip's War, it's definitely about them trying to figure out ways to create a confederacy to unite and resist against the British who are expanding. We've got another question that's already been asked. Do we have to know the people's name for each section? I'm not sure what that means, but you will definitely need to know specific individuals from your textbook and how they relate to the facts of your content. So I'll give you a second to see if any other questions pop up. I don't see any more questions for this evening, so hopefully we're good. This link is going to be available for you guys on YouTube, so you'll be able to watch it again later if you need to. So, what is Malinch? So this is a woman who was involved in the downfall of the Aztec Empire, but I had to look that up, which guarantees that you're not going to be seeing it on the test tomorrow. Let me see. How long is the test? It's going to be 50 questions. It'll be finished up by the end of the class period, done online. Slaves wanted to get to Spanish Florida in the Stono Rebellion. Why did they want to get to Florida? Because they were controlled by the Spanish, and in Spanish Florida, instead of holding on to the slave system that the Carolinas and Georgia had, they've got their own system that's much more tolerant. So they're hoping to find a haven with like the Seminoles who are down there. I don't see any other questions at this point, so hopefully you guys are good. Good luck tonight. Get some rest, get some sleep, and come to class prepared tomorrow. Remember also, this is your first test, so you're kind of getting a feel for what these tests are about. And so for you guys, if the first test doesn't go well, remember we get a chance to throw out one test per quarter. And if tomorrow ends up being that test, we'll be able to deal with that. We've got, let me see here, who were Hernan Cortez and Francisco Pizarro? They're the ones who conquered both the Aztecs in Cortez's case, and Pizarro conquered the Incas. So they're two conquistadors. I did lose the L in play ball. It fell off when we were trying to do some dusting recently, and so I need to get it put back up there. But we got bigger fish to fry to help you guys out. So good luck this evening. Get a good night's sleep. Let me know if you need any sort of other help. But at this point, if you've been doing the review so far and getting yourself ready, you should be in good shape. So good luck to guys tonight, guys. Thanks for stopping by. Hopefully this was helpful, and I'll see you tomorrow.